All right, good evening, everyone. Hope everyone is doing well. It's good to be here tonight. I'm substitute teaching for Jay. He had a work event, and Jim is under the weather. And I'm just thankful to be here because our family had the norovirus over the weekend, and that was rough. That was very rough. So we all went through that one and are happy to be on the other side. So went down fast, but recovered fast. Tonight we are going to be talking through one of probably the most popular stories in Daniel, one of my favorite, with Daniel in the lion's den. It's going to be both tonight and then also spilling over onto Sunday. And so if you would turn to Daniel chapter 6, we're going to study this first half of the chapter here. Obviously a story that many of us have known since we were little children, but it's always refreshing to read these stories as an adult and in the context of this study that we've done as the whole book of Daniel, because at least for me, my eyes get opened every time and I see different little elements of it that I don't know that I would have ever picked up on as a kid, right? And so you start seeing the bigger themes that God is playing throughout here, and many things that we've talked about throughout the course of this study in Daniel, but I think are again evident here tonight. So with that, let's start with the word of prayer, and then we'll dig in on chapter 6 here tonight. Our Father in heaven, Lord God, we are so thankful for you. We are grateful, Lord, for this family that meets here. We're thankful for the chance that we can come together, that we have the freedom to do so, that we can open your holy word, that we can study about you, that we can be drawn closer to you, Father, and that we can put these words into our heart and into action in our lives, that we can serve you, for you and you alone are King. Father, and we are so grateful for this book of Daniel. We are thankful, Father, for the character that we see in Daniel the man, but also the theme of you and your power and your sovereignty, Father, and we know that is just as true today as it was back in Daniel's time. And so, Father, as we study this lesson tonight and we look at Daniel and the trials that he faced and the punishment and severity of the lion's den, Father, we pray that we see your hand in that and your saving grace in that, and that we, Father, can be drawn to you even more. And so, Lord, please bless us tonight. Bless all of the teachers, bless all of the students, and Father, help us to be built up so that we can go out into this world and shine and reflect your glory. In your Son's name we pray. Amen. Okay, so Daniel chapter 6, just a little bit of recap here. I've got to go old man and put my glasses on because I can't read the screen from here. But as we've talked about, we've been going through this study chronologically, which is not at all in order of the chapter sequence. And we're going to touch on that again here tonight, just how this fits in. But you can see here the timeline of the book, right? We start with chapter 1. We're now all the way down to chapter 6 at the very bottom, which is a period of, some 65 years. And so if you just stop there alone and just take the overall context of Daniel as a young, call it 15-year-old being taken away to captivity and now living there for 65 years, and then this event happens to him. I think we lose that when we read this through chapter by chapter because it happens relatively early in the book. But, just doing the math, that means Daniel is probably 80 years old when these events happen. And so think of that. Just keep that in the back of your mind as you decipher and re-study this story of Daniel in the lion's den. Here is an aged man who has seen and endured a lot. We've obviously seen throughout all of these previous stories that he obviously is wise beyond his years, and I guess in this situation has the years to back it up. And here is a faithful man after this after 65 years in captivity going through these events. And so I think that is point number one that just strikes me again as we restudy this. As we flip then and look at how it's written, remember that there's a literary structure here. There's this chiastic structure. And so we've talked about this before, that when you look at specifically chapters 1 through 7, that's kind of the first section of this book, that it creates this structure that is really drawn to emphasize the underlying points of those chapters. You can tell, actually, I'm gonna tell on Jay a little bit. I got these slides from Jay, who I'm filling in with tonight. You can tell Jim didn't build these slides and Jay did because he's got emojis on the slides. And so I don't know that Jim would have ever put a fire emoji or a lion emoji on there. I don't know that I would have either. That gap happened somewhere between Jay and I's age that happened. But I appreciate the context that gives. But as we look at this, right, and we remember what we studied back leading up to this, where in chapter 2 we saw that first vision. We see the great statue, and we see that what God's message here is we're dealing with kingdoms of men and who's really in control. And then we went to chapter 3 in the fiery furnace, and we see Daniel's 3 friends and how they're tried, their faith is tested, and yet God is there to sustain them and deliver them. And then in chapters 4, we see this dream of the story of Nebuchadnezzar, right? How he looks over the expanse of the kingdom of Babylon and how he proclaims, look at all what I have done. And God humbles him, right? And we see then in Nebuchadnezzar's response that he puts God first and God lifts him up. And then we fast forward to Belshazzar, Nebuchadnezzar's, one of his descendants, a ruler that comes after him. And we see a similar thing at that peak there, right? Where we see that Belshazzar looks out at the kingdom again and he says, look at all that I have done. And then God sends the hand to write on the wall. And he says, your kingdom is measured. Your time is here. And rather than lift up God, Belshazzar does the opposite of Nebuchadnezzar, and he continues to put his pride before God. And it says that very night he's killed and the kingdom is turned over to the Medes and Persians. And so now if we work our way back, we see the symbolism with the trials. And so similar to how Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego faced these trials, their faith is tested in God, and they face these punishments. We're going to see Daniel go through the same. And of course, we know this story, so we know that God delivers Daniel. And then that takes us to chapter 7, which we've studied, but it goes back to these visions of these 4 kingdoms. And so we've talked about it throughout these stories, but if we were to throw out a general theme, and there's probably a couple of themes that we could really point to in at least these chapters of Daniel, what would you say that is? What is one of those key central themes or messages that God, I believe, wants us to understand here as we read and understand these chapters? Judgment. I heard it. Is that Tim? Okay. Judgment, absolutely. I think we can build on that. What else? Okay, absolutely. In fact, when you look at chapter 4 and kind of that peak of it, it repeats it 3 times where he says that God is the one who places kings where they are. He can take kingdoms away, and it is God who is everlasting. And so God is in control is definitely that theme. And God uses judgment to prove that here. Anything else? What other themes, what other aspects of this have we studied and you see in this? Deliverance, absolutely. We see that those that are faithful to God, He is faithful Himself, and He delivers them. And so we see that throughout Daniel, and we see that in Daniel, absolutely. Anything else? Yeah. Isn't that crazy? God can use these evil ruders for His own purposes. I find that still fascinating to think about, that God is using men I don't know, were they aware that God was using them? I think they probably put their pride before that. But God can use evil men for His own purposes. And so who are we to limit what God has put into place in those capacities? Anything else? I think we hit the big ones for sure. And so as we then drill into chapter 6, keep all of that background in mind, and hopefully that will help frame what we're studying here as we re-look at, as adults, this story that we've learned as children. And as we really kick that off, we kind of hinted at this already, But here Daniel has lived through multiple rulers and has been in a position of prominence for multiple rulers. And in a very sudden change of events, now the Medes and Persians take over. And so just capping off of what we had previously studied there, that Belshazzar, that very night is when he was killed. And that's the story of the handwriting on the wall and the fact that, again, one of those kind of peak themes is that when you lift yourself up, God will humble you. And when you humble yourself, God will lift you. And so we see that play out, and now here we're going to see Daniel humble himself and be lifted. And so let's turn to chapter 6, and let's start reading here, starting in verse 1. And it says, "It pleased Darius to set over the kingdom 120 satraps to be throughout the whole kingdom, and over them 3 high officials, of whom Daniel was one, to whom these satraps should give an account, so that the king might suffer no loss. Then this Daniel became distinguished above all the other high officials and satraps, because an excellent spirit was in him, and the king planned to set him over the whole kingdom." So what is a satrap or satrap or however you want to pronounce it? How do we understand that? What is that? A governor, yeah. A leader, kind of a providential king, right? So some of the notes that we had pulled together, Jim in particular had pulled together on just some of the history pieces of this, is, let me see here. So Darius the Mede was one that really pushed this out. Under the Median kings, the satraps ruled part of their territories as vassal kings. They had a lot of independent authority. Cyrus believed that he ruled by divine right, and so he used these satraps to essentially report to him. But it presents an interesting situation, right? Because if we back up to some of the visions that we saw and we know the future, think in particular of what happened to the Greek Empire. It was separated into 4 different areas and 4 leaders, and as a result, it splintered, right? And so think about it in terms of what could happen in these situations with these different governors. Is they could, I guess all you have to really do is look at our own politics, right? We have senators, we have representatives, and they're over a certain jurisdiction, but for some reason when they're all in Washington, it seems like they're always jockeying for some sort of position and power and to be in some sort of prominent position. And so I think if we read between the lines and look at some of the history, there's definitely some similarities there that we see with these satraps. They carried out punishments for crimes. They collected taxes. They maintained order in the provinces. One of the things that is interesting is that there are 120. And so as we dig into some of the history behind this, we have seen, or there's record of how they broke out the Persian Empire. And so you can see all of the different providential areas. Now, one of the interesting things actually is if we look at Ezra, let's see, Ezra chapter 1, it actually says that Persia was divided up into 127 different provinces. And yet here we also see in Daniel that there's 120 satraps. And so there has been actually a lot of commentators that have tried to understand the difference between that number. And frankly, the best reasoning that has come about is that certain leaders oversaw multiple provinces. And so that could be one of those explanations. But either which way, we have this broken out. And so that kind of sets the table. But as a result then, what do these 120 satraps, I guess let me back up. What else do we know about just the setup here from the first 3 verses? We've got the 120 satraps throughout the whole kingdom. And then what else? Okay, so like any good big organization, you've got different levels of hierarchy, right? you've got these leaders over each province, but then they report to these three high leaders over them, these three high officials, by reference then report to the king. And so this is part of a way that the king just is managing the flow of law and order, of communication, of protecting, his rightful rule over the kingdom. And where does Daniel fall in this? Yeah, there's a little bit of variation in how you can read it, right? It says Daniel became distinguished above all of the other high officials and satraps. And so one reading is he is one of those three. Another reading is maybe he's in between those three and the king. And I don't know that we know for certainty on that, but he's at least in this position above these satraps. And then what else do we learn, even just from these three verses, about the situation, just setting the scene here? Yeah, the king favored him. It says that because there was an excellent spirit upon him. Now, since we have studied the book in the way that we have, we've seen Daniel throughout his 65 years in captivity, and so we know that this is Daniel, right? This is not the first time, and so put yourself also just in the context of it. Here, Daniel has served multiple kings for this entire duration, and now with the new king and new leaders and new players at the table, here he's finding himself in this position of excellence, and the king favors him. And so obviously we know the story, and we know how that's going to shake out. So let's keep reading here then. So in verse 4, then the high officials and the satraps sought to find a ground for complaint against Daniel with regard to the kingdom, but they could find no ground for complaint or any fault, because he was faithful and no error or fault was found in him. Then these men said, we shall not find any ground for complaint against this Daniel unless we find it in connection with the law of his God. All right, so what is their motive? Seems like jealousy, yeah. Seems like jealousy is at play here. Daniel is in a position of favor. And again, I can't help but liken this to our own politics, right? There's about to be some sort of backstabbing happening here. And they're trying to set the stage to humble Daniel in these means. What else sticks out to you? Yeah. Yeah, so their perceived weakness of Daniel is his firm commitment to faith. I mean, how lucky would we be if that's what our enemies decided was our weakness, is our faith in God. And so, of course, this is the theme. This is one of these stories at play here, is that God lifts those who are faithful, and God delivers those that are faithful here. Okay, what else? What else sticks out? Absolutely. There's definitely parallels to Jesus here. Okay? Any other thoughts? One of the points that Jim had pulled out is, if you just take a step back, it's kind of hard to think about how 120 different, or I guess 123 or 122, however we do the math there, 122 different leaders all came together and conspired against this one man. And certainly that could be it, right? Surface level, that is it. But, we could probably also theorize other situations where there was, those closer to the king that saw Daniel in this prominence and then spurred up others and brought on this cohesion against him. But either way, what we are left with the scripture is that Daniel was one man against many. And so that is one of the other, I guess, common stories throughout the Bible, right? Is is that God does not need many, God can use few. And so God uses one man in Daniel here to stand up to all of the other providential leaders across the entire kingdom to unveil God's will here. Let's see. So, how can we apply this to ourselves? Let's make this a little bit more practical here, not just a history lesson. How can we learn even from what we've read so far and apply this to ourselves? How do we find ourselves perhaps in similar situations?
You would like to have that reputation. You can have where it says there in verse 5, we can't find anything that, go against him.
Yeah.
Complain. He seems to be above any kind of reproach, they would say.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a great one. Jay Clark.
What would be great about that, as Eric's point is, if they were consistent with the law of our God, that would get others, all right, let's find what's wrong with this God so we can have something against him. And that might actually end up converting them in the process if they were to actually study.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, obviously, yeah, God uses us even through those trials as an example. So yeah, they can have that spillover impact. Okay, what else? Yeah, yeah. You don't have to raise your hand on this, but whoever has felt or been targeted by others in a workplace situation or a school situation, I mean, sadly, this is relevant for us today. Satan is at work everywhere, even in the workplace. Psalms 37, 12 through 13 says, "The wicked plots against the righteous and gnashes his teeth at him, but the Lord laughs at the wicked, for he sees that his day is coming." Ecclesiastes 4:4 says, "Then I saw that all toil and all skill and work come from a man's envy of his neighbor. This also is vanity and a striving after wind." Philippians 2:15, "Be blameless and innocent, children of God, without blemish in the midst of a crooked and twisted generation, among whom you shine as lights in the world." Right? And so I think if you haven't experienced that in your life, we certainly are subject to that, or can be subject to that. And unfortunately, wicked is in this world. And so, again, though, how blessed would we be if the only fault anybody could find against us is our firm faith and commitment in God. Let's see, a couple of other things. Wickedness is there in devising and scheming and plotting, right? Like we see that set up here with the 120, and you can see how this thing kind of grows legs and builds and builds and builds. Job 5:13 says, "He catches the wise in their own craftiness, and the schemes of the wily are brought to a quick end." Proverbs 24:8 and 9, "Whoever plans to do evil will be called a schemer. The devising schemer of folly is sin, and the scoffer is an abomination to mankind." Isaiah 32:7, "As for the scoundrel, his devices are evil. He plans wicked schemes to ruin the poor with lying words, even when the plea of the needy is right." Proverbs 6:16, "There are 6 things that the Lord hates, 7 that are abomination to him." Paraphrased, "A heart that devises wicked plans, feet that make haste to run to evil." And so if we think we are immune to this today, then we have fooled ourselves. And so let's use Daniel as an example of how to handle this. Any other thoughts?
Dan, when it talks about Daniel having an excellent spirit,
Yeah.
it doesn't really describe him that way anywhere else in the book. So I look at that and I go, here's Daniel at his old age, and he's still growing.
Yeah.
He's still maturing, and he's at a point where even under these new powers that be, he's still showing the type of character and the type of person that he is. So he's almost like a Caleb to me. He's just
Yeah.
even at old age, still going strong and maturing and growing, and we should
Yeah, yeah, it's a great point. Great point. Okay. Why do you think the plot was centered around prayer? Right? That's ultimately where they know or realize they're going to catch him. So why do you think it was around prayer? Okay.
So they knew all they had to do was set up a decree. Let's make it a point to obey the ruler of the day or obey this god or goddess.
Yeah.
And we can catch them.
Yeah. Okay. I think that's good. Yeah, Lynn?
You'd have to wonder, what did the high official satraps know about the law of God in order to plan something? You know, they pass a law, everyone has to worship the king. Well, what if they passed a law, everyone has to eat pig?
Yeah.
You know, how much did they know about the law in order to set up the premise that was going to, you know,
Yeah.
deal with Daniel?
Yeah. Yeah. How deep do these schemes go, right? Doug?
I think they just knew it was a habit that he practiced, so they knew they could catch him.
Yeah. Yeah. At a very basic level, we can imply that it was an outward expression that Daniel did, right? They knew he did it. They could tell Daniel was praying and praying often. You know, that makes me kind of stop in my own tracks and say, ooh, you know, if you asked all of my coworkers around me, would they know that I pray, period? Would they know that I pray so often that if, you know, that could be an avenue? But Daniel's obviously living out his faith. He is demonstrating it in a daily way. Somebody had their hand up. Lynn? Yeah.
Does the old law require prayer in a window 3 times a day?
Okay, we're going to get to that in a second, because I think there is a little nuance that is interesting in this. What do you think, though?
I don't think it does. I've often wondered, why did Daniel just say, all right, for the time being, I won't
Yeah.
engage in that particular public practice, but there was something in Daniel that said, I'm not going to change how I worship God.
Right. Yeah. So could Daniel have just as easily decided to pray in his heart for the time period that was this duration, this 30 days, and not changed anything from a spiritual sense with his worship to God to avoid this trap? And there's nothing that I'm aware of in the law that would say prescribedly no. But Daniel felt convicted not to change for this, is I think what we can imply from the story. Okay, that's a good thought though. But there is some other details on how he prayed, and so we'll get to that in just a second here. Any other thoughts? Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, and right. He uses this example to teach all. I mean, we can learn from it. These evil men learn from it. The whole world has hopefully learned from this or can learn from this. Any other thoughts? Titus 2 verse 7 and 8 says, show yourself in all respects to be a model of good works, and in your teaching show integrity, dignity, sound speech that cannot be condemned, so that an opponent may be put to shame, having nothing evil to say about you. And so Paul is writing that to a young evangelist, but how true are those instructions for us as well? And in the exact same vein of Daniel here, that we would show ourselves to be a model of good works, and that if an opponent may be put to shame, having nothing evil to say about us. You know, one of the interesting things about Daniel as well, we've kind of hinted at it, but apparently these satraps didn't have any ground for accusation in his work either, right? From what we can tell, the only accusation they could come up with was to trap him in his faith. But I think that silence also gives some indication that Daniel was faithful in his duties, both to the king and to God. And so, again, maybe a good example for us to follow as well there. Yes.
You know, it probably also says something about the general nature of satraps and the high officials, that pilfering, dishonesty was probably very common.
Yeah.
So what they're doing, well, let's look at Daniel and see if he is doing the same, and he wasn't.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a good point. Yeah. Okay. Let's keep reading. Verses 6 says, Then these high officials and satraps came by agreement to the king and said to him, O King Darius, live forever. All the high officials of the kingdom, the prefects, the satraps, the counselors, the governors, are agreed that the king should establish an ordinance and enforce an injunction that whoever makes petition to any god or man for 30 days, except to you, O king, shall be cast into the den of lions. Now, O king, establish the injunction and sign the document so that it cannot be changed according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, which cannot be revoked. Therefore, King Darius signed the document and injunction. Okay, so in this section, what sticks out? They certainly seem to be, right? Now they say, "Oh, King Darius, live forever," right? And you know, I mean, different commentators have weighed in on that. You know, there's a common belief that these kings felt like not only were they, you know, divinely ordained to reign, but that they were divine themselves, and that in some capacity they would live forever. So, but it certainly seems like they're very flattering to him and approaching him to appeal to his ego here. King, live forever. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So what's even interesting about that, Jim had pulled this out in our study. You know, as we fast forward in history, when we see the Greek Empire, Antiochus Epiphanes is one of those four, comes out of one of those four regions of the Greek Empire, and greatly persecutes the Jewish nation. And so Epiphanes, what's an epiphany? Who wants to define an epiphany? A revelation, right? So Antiochus named himself Epiphanes because it's as if God revealed himself to Antiochus, right? He put himself in that level, in that same stage. And so, and as we learned through history, Antiochus was a terrible persecutor of Jews. In fact, that's the whole Maccabean revolution, if you read about that and kind of that intertestament period in there. But even as evil as Antiochus Epiphanes was, and he himself believing that he was God, we have no record that he ever even went this far of pray to me and only me for 30 days. And so kind of an interesting just comparison here as we look at, frankly, a list of very evil rulers, but this is a pretty absurd proposal, isn't it? We will flatter you and you alone, king, and for 30 days, no man can do anything but make their pledges to you. Okay, so what else sticks out?
But it's only for 30 days.
Yeah, isn't that interesting?
Why not do it forever?
Yeah.
Why not do it for a year?
Right,
Why not do it for as long as I live?
right,
Why 30 days?
right. That's a great question. I mean, I don't know that we can fully answer that, but other than it certainly just feels like this trap, right? I mean, they're setting this whole thing up as a trap. And so, but yeah, why 30 days? It's such a strange proposal when, you know, especially us as outside viewers and readers of this coming back, we can ask a lot of questions about this. Okay, what else?
Danny had brought up a proverb in what you had said before about the wicked. And if you go back to Solomon's Proverbs, I mean, it's chock full of that when it shows the differences between the wicked and the righteous. And he says it many, many times. It's almost like a broken record when you read through all of the Proverbs. But it's really just to drill home just how true it is.
Yeah,
I looked up those Proverbs
It's a great one to bring up. Definitely fits what's happening, doesn't it? How would you enforce this? I mean, we've already kind of talked about it, right? Like, if you're a pious person, what would prevent you from just saying, I'm going to pray in my heart here? And so how would you enforce this if you were the king or, trying to set this trap? Lynn, what do you think?
We're in a culture of private prayer, where probably most of our prayers in our lives are silent.
Yeah.
Different culture, all of their prayers are going to be audible, are going to be spoken in a public place. Even Daniel, he prayed 3 times a day. How did they know he wasn't praying to the king? Well, because it was out loud. He was speaking it. So that's probably was the practice of the Medes and Persians, that it was public, it was done by the priest, it was done by everyone, and it was audible there.
Yeah, I think that's probably right. I think there's certainly an element that there's more formality to it. But I mean, that said, who is it? Help me out. Ezra, Nehemiah, right? Nehemiah before the king. It says he prayed to God right then and there. And so maybe that was audible. I don't know, but I don't get that idea when reading Nehemiah. And so, yeah, I mean, could it have been silent? I think probably yes. If somebody disagrees with that, I'd love to study that further. I don't know any reason why it couldn't be. But here's the other question of this is we can read this and we can kind of see the trap happening, right? Like there's so much that doesn't fully make sense about this that it almost kind of makes you a little suspicious. Why would the king have so easily gone along with this? Vanity for one. I think that is one potential answer. I think another is maybe he's playing how to keep control, right? Here you've got 120 of these providential leaders all together. And so now what happens when the king says no? That's a big strain on his authority all of a sudden. And is this one of those situations he wants to exercise and put that authority to the test or not? I don't know. At either event, I'm sure we could speculate over other ways, but the king is pulled into this trap, and now here Daniel is the subject of it. Okay, let's keep going then. Verse is 10. So when Daniel knew, one last thing. What's also of interest about this law that he signs?
Cannot be revoked.
Cannot be revoked. What else does that remind you of? Story in the Bible, similar king here, similar kingdom. Esther, I heard somebody say it. Esther, you remember the story of Esther? Once the law was signed, you can't undo it. And so we're kind of corroborating both of those stories through this, but interesting, right? And so they have respect for this rule of law, that once it's signed, it can't be undone. So verses 10, when Daniel knew that the document had been signed, he went to his house where he had windows in his upper chamber open toward Jerusalem. He got down on his knees 3 times a day and prayed and gave thanks before his God as he had done previously. Then these men came by agreement and found Daniel making petition and plea before his God. Then they came near and said before the king concerning the injunction, O king, did you not sign an injunction that anyone who makes petition to any god or man within 30 days except to you, O king, shall be cast into the den of lions? The king answered and said, the thing stands fast according to the law of the Medes and Persians, which cannot be revoked. Then they answered and said before the king, Daniel, who is one of the exiles from Judah, pays no attention to you, O king, or the injunction you have signed, but makes his petition 3 times a day. Okay, so let's see. We've got a few minutes here. What sticks out in this section then? Okay, so we can break that down into a couple of things. Daniel we of course already know, goes about his business. He does it in his house. What else sticks out? As he had done previously. So he makes no attempt to change. And again, we've talked about that, but we see that his faithfulness overrides any temptation to conform to this. Okay, Judy, what did you say? They came by agreement, right? Like they knew what was happening. They are fulfilling their trap here. What else? Yeah, collusion. They're definitely colluding. They're definitely colluding against Daniel. Okay, what else? Yeah, he wasn't in the closet, was he? He was somewhere where he could be caught. So he was confident. He didn't change his practice. Okay. He is in his house. Yeah, it wasn't in the public, so we don't know, right? Maybe he did in the public before. We don't know. Right. Okay. Well,
As he had done before versus like it doesn't sound like he's trying to go out and seek persecution for persecution's sake. He's not trying to be like Jesus said in Matthew, go out as the
Right.
hypocrites do. It was more, I'm going to continue what I'm doing. I'm not going to change for this law, but I'm not going to performatively try to go above and beyond.
Right.
Gathering.
Right. Yeah. I mean, and honestly, we see Daniel's, we see how wise he is at handling a lot of these situations throughout his life. He's not seen to be provoking this further, but he is maintaining his faith. I think one other interesting thing, and we've talked a little bit about this, is he prays towards Jerusalem. Did you catch that? In his upper chamber open towards Jerusalem. So if you turn to 1 Kings chapter 8, there's an interesting tie-in here. Because in 1 Kings chapter 8, the temple is built for the first time. Solomon builds it and he dedicates it to the Lord, and he has all the people there. And as they're dedicating it, Solomon says this great and lengthy prayer, and I wish we had time to read all of it, starting in verse 22. But time and time again here, he talks about in his prayer, when your people look towards this temple, would you deliver them effectively? And he even goes so far. So it's talking about when your warriors are out at battle and they look towards the temple, grant them victory. And he even goes as far as look at verse 46 in chapter 8. He says, when they, that's the people, when they sin against you, for there is no one who does not sin, and you are angry with them and hand them over to the enemy, and their captors deport them to the enemy's country, whether distant or nearby, and when they come to their senses in the land where they were deported and repent and petition you in their captors' land, we have sinned and done wrong, we have been wicked. And when they return to you with all their heart and with all their soul in the land of their enemies who took them captive, and when they pray to you in the direction of their land that you gave their ancestors, the city you have chosen and the temple I have built for your name, may you hear in heaven, your dwelling place, their prayer and petition, and uphold their cause. And here you see Daniel doing exactly that. And maybe more importantly, we see God doing exactly what Solomon asks of him. Because God in his heavenly places hears Daniel. And how awesome is that? Okay, that's all we have time for. Jay is going to take us through the rest of this chapter and obviously the big reveal of what happens. But really appreciate everybody's attention and participation.